Kenya's deputy president might not actually be Kenya's deputy president, not politically, legally. A court has ruled that the judges who approved his rise to office may not have had the authority to do it in the first place. And while that legal storm was already brewing, one of Kenya's most outspoken lawyers just gave him a deadline: resign before October, or, in his words, it will be too late. Today we're breaking down the legitimacy crisis swallowing Deputy President Kithure Kindiki, the court ruling, the political pylon, and what it means for a government that's already been through one deputy president's exit. To understand why this matters, you need to rewind to October 2024. Rigathi Gachagua, Ruto's original running mate and deputy president, was impeached and removed from office in a dramatic parliamentary process that Kenyans are still arguing about today. Days later, President Ruto nominated Kithure Kindiki, his sitting Interior Cabinet Secretary and a former law professor, to replace him. Kindiki wasn't a random pick. He's a trained lawyer, a former Senate Majority Leader, and crucially, from the Mount Kenya region, the same electoral bloc Gachagua represented. Replacing one Mount Kenya figure with another was widely read as an attempt to hold on to that voting bloc without missing a beat. Kindiki was sworn in on November 1, 2024. For the past year and a half, he's functioned as Kenya's deputy president with no real controversy about his legitimacy until now. Here's the story that should be dominating headlines, but hasn't gotten nearly enough attention outside Kenya. A Court of Appeal ruling found that the High Court bench, which originally cleared Kindiki's swearing in, the panel of judges who approved the process after Gachagua's impeachment, was, in the court's own words, improperly constituted. Let that sink in. This isn't a politician calling foul. This isn't a protest or a tweet. This is an appellate court saying the legal process that Kenya's current deputy president may not have followed proper procedure. What does improperly constituted actually mean? In simple terms, the composition of the judicial bench who was allowed to sit on it, how they were selected, didn't meet the legal requirements for a ruling of that magnitude. It's a procedural failure, but a procedural failure at the exact moment that mattered most. The moment that made Kindiki's deputy presidency official. The ruling doesn't automatically remove Kindiki from office. Kenyan law is more complicated than that, and there are additional legal steps, potential appeals, potential rehearings before anything changes on paper. But it opens a door that Kindiki's opponents have been waiting for, and they've wasted no time walking through it. Opposition leader Kalonzo Musyoka didn't waste a single news cycle. His response was blunt: Kindiki must resign because he is, in Kalonzo's words, an illegitimate deputy president. Not disputed, not questionable. Illegitimate, full stop. But here's what makes this story genuinely unusual. The pressure isn't only coming from the opposition. It's coming from inside the room. Senior counsel Ahmad Nasir Abdullahi is one of Kenya's most prominent, most outspoken lawyers. And he is not a Kindiki outsider swinging from the sidelines. He's a voice that's been closely tied to conversations within Ruto's own political orbit. And Ahmad Nasir has been remarkably direct. He's publicly urged President Ruto to drop Kindiki entirely from the ticket ahead of 2027, describing him in blunt terms as a political liability who, quote, adds nothing useful to the ticket. Then he went further. Ahmad Nasir directly told Kindiki to resign before October 2026, with a warning that should stop anyone in their tracks, or it will be too late. Too late for what, exactly? Ahmad Nasir didn't spell it out publicly, and that ambiguity is doing a lot of work in Kenyan political commentary right now. Is he referring to the ongoing legal process, implying that if Kindiki waits too long, the courts will force the issue for him? Is he referring to Ruto's own political calculus ahead of 2027? Suggesting that if Kindiki doesn't step aside voluntarily, he'll be pushed aside regardless? Or is this simply rhetorical pressure, designed to force Kindiki's hand while the legitimacy question is still fresh in the public's mind? Whatever the intent, the effect is the same. One of the most connected legal voices in Kenya is now on record, giving Kenya's sitting deputy president a public deadline to leave office. It's worth pausing here, because Kenya has genuinely never faced a deputy president situation quite like this. Gachagua's removal in 2024 was dramatic, a parliamentary impeachment process. Contested every step of the way, but it was, at least procedurally, resolved through the mechanisms the Constitution actually provides for removing a sitting official. What's happening to Kindiki is different. This isn't a fight over his performance in office, or his popularity, or even necessarily his relationship with Ruto. This is a fight over whether the legal foundation of his appointment was ever solid to begin with. If the courts ultimately agree that the original bench was improperly constituted in a way that invalidates their ruling, Kenya would be looking at a deputy president whose entire tenure could face a genuine legal clout, not just a political one. And remember, This comes only about 18 months after Gachagwa's own dramatic exit. A second consecutive deputy president controversy, this close together, raises real questions about the stability of that office heading into the already since 2027 election cycle. So where does this actually go from here? Realistically, there are three paths. 1. Kindiki's legal team appeals or seeks clarification on the ruling. The process drags through the courts for months, and he remains in office while the legal question stays technically unresolved, which is often how these things play out in practice. 2. The political pressure from figures like Ahmed Desir builds enough momentum that Ruto quietly manages Kindiki's exit before 2027, choosing a different running mate rather than risk carrying a legally contested deputy president into an election year. 3. Kindiki digs in, refuses to resign, and this becomes one of the defining legal and political fights of the entire pre-2027 season, playing out alongside the TIFA poll numbers, the ODM civil war, and everything else already reshaping Kenya's political map. None of these are quick or clean, but all three keep this story firmly in the headlines for months to come. So, here's the question worth sitting with. Does Kenya's deputy president survive this, or does history repeat itself less than 2 years after the last one was forced out? Drop your prediction in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of every twist in Kenya's road to 2027, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is only getting started.